He was humiliated by the girl he loved. 2 weeks later, he sought revenge. Martin wasn't just an average teenager. He was tall and broad, with a weight that made him an easy target for the school's bullies. His 220-pound frame seemed to invite cruel nicknames like Meatball Martin and The Mountain. The laughter of his classmates haunted him in quiet moments, echoing in his mind like a broken record. Yet, beneath the surface of this quiet, insecure boy was a dreamer. Martin loved art and music. His favorite pastime was sketching portraits of people he admired, often losing himself in the lines and shades on the paper. It was his refuge, a small world where he could create beauty without fear of judgment. But the real anchor to his days was Alyssa Bennett. Alyssa was everything Martin wasn't: popular, radiant, and seemingly untouchable. Her golden hair caught the sunlight like a halo, and her laughter was the melody that lifted the spirits of everyone around her. To Martin, she wasn't just the queen of the school, she was his beacon of light in a dark sea of self-doubt. Her smile, even if it wasn't directed at him, was enough to make his day a little brighter. But she didn't know he existed, or so he thought. One afternoon, as Martin sat in the library sketching in his notebook, a shadow fell over his page. He looked up and froze. There she was, Alyssa Bennett, smiling down at him. His heart skipped a beat, his palms growing clammy. "Hey, Martin, right?" she asked casually. He nodded, too stunned to speak. "There's a party at my house this Friday. You should come," she said, her smile widening. Martin blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Me? Are you sure?" Alyssa giggled, the sound like tinkling bells. "Of course. You're in my art class, right? I've seen your sketches. They're really good. You should bring some to show everyone." Before he could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd of students like a dream fading into the morning light. Martin sat there for a long time, his heart racing. She noticed me, he thought over and over again. She noticed me. That moment ignited a spark of hope in Martin's heart. Maybe things could change. Maybe he could be more than the invisible boy at school. The rest of the week passed in a blur of anticipation and nervous excitement. Martin decided he wanted to make the best impression possible. For the first time in years, he stood in front of his mirror, inspecting himself critically. He needed to look good for the party. With what little savings he had, he rented a sleek black suit that fit snugly around his broad shoulders. He borrowed a luxury car from his uncle, who reluctantly agreed after much pleading. He even pooled together money from his small circle of friends to buy Alyssa a beautiful bouquet of roses and a silver bracelet he hoped she'd like. "This is my chance," Martin whispered to himself on the night of the party. His reflection in the mirror looked almost unrecognizable, a boy in a suit, his hair neatly combed, and a nervous smile tugging at his lips. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. The night air was crisp and carried the faint hum of music and laughter from Alyssa's party. Martin sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his heart thundering with nervous anticipation. He glanced at the silver bracelet and the bouquet of roses on the passenger seat and allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. Tonight was supposed to be the turning point. Tonight, things would change. Stepping out of the car, Martin adjusted his rented suit and took a deep breath. The house in front of him glowed with warm lights, and through the large windows he could see students chatting, laughing, and dancing. The party looked just like he imagined it, glamorous, vibrant, and alive. It was a world he had always been on the outside of, but tonight he felt like he had a ticket in. Martin walked up to the door, clutching the gifts in his hands. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he rang the doorbell. Within seconds, the door swung open, and there she was, Alyssa Bennett, radiant as ever, her golden hair shining under the porch light. She greeted him with a smile that made his knees weak. "Martin, you made it," she exclaimed, stepping aside to let him in. Martin swallowed hard and nodded. Yeah, thanks for inviting me." As he stepped into the house, the lively chatter of students filled his ears. Some glanced at him, a few whispering to one another, but Martin kept his eyes on Alyssa. She was his anchor in the overwhelming scene. "These are for you," Martin said, holding out the roses and the bracelet. His voice was barely above a whisper, but he mustered all the courage he could. Alyssa's eyes lit up as she took the gifts. "Wow, Martin, these are beautiful, thank you," she said, her smile growing wider. Martin felt a flicker of pride. Maybe he had been wrong to doubt this. Maybe she really did see something in him. His chest swelled with hope as Alyssa turned to the crowd and clapped her hands for attention. "Hey, everyone," Alyssa called out, her voice cutting through the music and chatter. "I have something to say." Martin's heart raced. Was she about to introduce him? A small, nervous smile played on his lips as he stood beside her, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes. Alyssa held up the bracelet and twirled it in her fingers. "So, you all know Martin, right? Well, guess what? I actually got him to come to my party." The room was silent for a moment, and then, like a crashing wave, laughter erupted around him. Confused, Martin looked at Alyssa, her radiant smile now tinged with cruelty. "It was all a bet," she said, her voice sharp and mocking. "We wanted to see if I could get the biggest loser in school to fall for me." The laughter grew louder, stabbing Martin like knives. His heart sank. The hopeful flicker extinguished in an instant. He felt his cheeks burn as the realization hit him. This wasn't an invitation. It was a setup. From the corner of the room, Alyssa's boyfriend stepped forward, his smirk adding salt to Martin's wounds. "Seriously, man, did you actually think Alyssa would be into you?" He sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. Martin's vision blurred with tears. He wanted to say something, anything, but the lump in his throat choked the words before they could form. He felt the weight of every mocking gaze, every sneer, and every cruel laugh pressing down on him. He couldn't breathe. Without another word, Martin turned and bolted for the door. He heard the laughter follow him as he ran down the driveway, but he didn't look back. The night air hit him like a cold slap, but it did nothing to numb the pain coursing through him. He reached his car, fumbled with the keys, and climbed inside, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, he just sat there, his body shaking with sobs. The roses lay discarded on the passenger seat, their petals already wilting. The silver bracelet, meant to symbolize hope and admiration, now felt like a cruel joke. His tears blurred the dashboard and he let out a choked cry, pounding the steering wheel in frustration. He reached for his phone, desperate for distraction, but the first thing he saw was a notification. Someone had tagged him in a video. Curious and dreading what he might find, Martin opened the app. His stomach twisted as he saw clips from the party. Alyssa laughing, her boyfriend's cruel words, and the moment the crowd erupted into laughter. It was all there, replaying his humiliation for the world to see. Comments flooded the video. "Classic. Did you see his face?" "Loser of the year." Martin threw his phone onto the seat, unable to look at it any longer. His tears turned to anger, a fiery storm that consumed the sadness in his chest. How could they do this to him? How could she? "I'll show them," he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "They'll regret ever laughing at me." That night, as he lay in bed, the humiliation played over and over in his mind. But alongside the pain was a spark of determination. He had always been invisible, an easy target for their jokes. But not anymore. If they wanted to see him, he would make sure they never forgot. For the next 2 weeks, Martin disappeared. The lively halls of the school carried on without him, and the whispers about his humiliation at Alyssa's party began to fade. But Martin wasn't hiding. He was transforming. The morning started early, long before the sun rose. Martin tied his old sneakers, stepped outside, and began to run. The cold morning air stung his face, and his lungs burned with every step. But he kept going. He thought of the laughter, the taunts, the faces of those who had mocked him, and let the anger fuel his pace. He pushed through the pain, each step pounding his determination into the pavement. At home, he researched workouts, diets, and anything that could help him change. His parents noticed the shift but chose not to push for answers. They saw the determination in his eyes and the quiet resolve that filled the house. Martin traded his usual junk food for lean meals he prepared himself. He turned down soda and chips, replacing them with water and vegetables. He didn't just want to lose weight. He wanted to build strength, not just in his body but in his spirit. Each day was grueling, but the reflection in the mirror began to shift. Slowly, the boy who had once been defined by his insecurities began to find confidence in his efforts. When Martin returned to school, he wasn't sure what to expect. He wore a hoodie and kept his head low, hoping to ease back into the routine without drawing attention. As he walked through the halls, a few students glanced his way, whispering among themselves. He was leaner, his face more defined, his posture straighter. Even though he still felt a pang of nervousness, there was a quiet pride in how far he had come. Martin's first class of the day was biology. As he slid into his usual seat in the back, the whispers began again. From the corner of his eye, he saw Alyssa and her friends laughing. His stomach twisted, but he kept his gaze on the teacher, determined not to let them get to him. "Hey, mask boy," someone called out, referring to the mask he had worn before his break. The laughter erupted again, echoing through the room. Martin clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, but he didn't respond. Just as the taunts grew louder, a voice cut through the noise. "Leave him alone." The room fell silent as heads turned to the back of the class. Standing there was Elena Gray, a girl Martin had seen before but had never spoken to. She was petite, with messy auburn hair and glasses that framed her sharp eyes. Elena wasn't popular. In fact, she was often ignored or whispered about for her frugal clothes and quiet demeanor. But now, her voice carried strength. "Isn't it enough already?" she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the stairs. "You've had your fun. Just stop." The room seemed to hold its breath. Alyssa and her friends exchanged glances, their smirks faltering. "Oh, look," Alyssa sneered. "The charity case is sticking up for the loser. How sweet." Elena didn't flinch. She crossed her arms and stared Alyssa down. Better to be a charity case than a bully with nothing better to do. The class murmured, some students nodding in quiet agreement. Alyssa rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath, but she turned back to her group, the moment slipping from her grasp. After class, Martin approached Elena as she packed her books. He hesitated, unsure of what to say, but finally managed, "Thanks for that. You didn't have to, but thank you." Elena smiled, a small, knowing smile. "They're just loud. Loud people are usually the weakest." Her words struck something deep within Martin. He nodded, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "I owe you one." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "But if you ever need someone to sit with at lunch, I'm usually in the library." That was the beginning of a friendship Martin hadn't expected. Over the following days, he found himself drawn to the quiet corners of the library, where Elena spent her time sketching in her notebook or reading worn novels. They talked about everything: books, music, the pressures of school, and slowly Martin opened up about what had happened at the party. Elena listened intently, her face soft with understanding. When he finished, she said, "You're stronger than you think, Martin. They wanted to break you, but you're still here. That's more than most people could do." Her words stuck with him. With Elena's encouragement, Martin pushed himself harder, not just physically but mentally. He began to see himself differently, not as a victim, but as someone capable of change and resilience. Together, they shared tips and ideas for standing up to the judgmental world around them. One afternoon, as they walked home together, Martin noticed Elena's shoes. They were worn, the soles practically peeling off. He hesitated, then asked, "Why don't you get new shoes?" Elena shrugged. "Can't really afford them right now. My mom's paycheck covers the basics, but that's about it." Martin felt a pang of guilt. He had been so focused on his own pain that he hadn't considered what others might be going through. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Elena gave him a puzzled look. "Why?" "Because you've been through so much and yet you're still standing up for people. For me." She smiled softly, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Maybe because I know what it's like to feel invisible, and I don't think anyone deserves that." As the weeks went on, their bond grew stronger. Martin's transformation wasn't just about his body, it was about the person he was becoming. With Elena by his side, he started to believe in himself again, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. Martin's transformation continued, and with it came a newfound confidence. But alongside this confidence was the quiet anger that still simmered in his chest. The laughter from Alyssa's party and the humiliation he had endured replayed in his mind like a broken record. Yet, instead of lashing out, Martin channeled his emotions into something more calculated, a plan to teach Alyssa a lesson she would never forget. One afternoon, as Martin and Elena sat in the library, their usual spot tucked away from the noise of the school, Martin confided in her. "Do you think people ever get what they deserve?" Elena looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes narrowing in thought. "I think sometimes they do, but it doesn't always happen the way we expect." "Why do you ask?" Martin hesitated, tapping his fingers on the table. "I've been thinking about Alyssa, about what she did, and I don't think she even realizes how cruel she was." Elena's brow furrowed. "Martin, what are you planning?" "Nothing. Extreme," he assured her quickly. "But I want her to understand what it feels like, to be humiliated, to have the world turned against you, even for just a moment." Elena sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Revenge doesn't always make you feel better. Trust me, I've thought about it more times than I can count. But I get it. Just don't lose yourself in the process, okay?" Martin nodded, her words lingering in his mind. He didn't want to become like Alyssa, but he couldn't shake the need to hold her accountable. That evening, Martin scrolled through social media, his mind spinning with ideas. As he browsed, a familiar name popped up: Nate Carter, his cousin. Nate was a rising singer, gaining attention online for his soulful voice and charismatic presence. His following was small but growing steadily, and Martin knew one thing for certain: Alyssa was a fan. He had seen her comment on Nate's posts before, leaving long, gushing messages about how much she admired him. The pieces began to fall into place. If Alyssa idolized Nate, perhaps he could use that to his advantage. The next day, Martin called Nate. "Hey, I need a favor," he said. "Sure, what's up?" Nate replied, his voice easygoing. "Can I borrow your account for a bit just to message someone? I promise it's nothing weird." Nate hesitated, but eventually agreed. "Okay, but don't do anything that'll ruin my reputation, all right?" "Promise," Martin said with a smirk. Using Nate's account, Martin crafted a message to Alyssa. He kept it short but charming, knowing it would catch her attention. "Hi, Alyssa, I've noticed your comments on my posts. Thanks for the support. Are you excited about your school prom? It sounds like fun." Within minutes, Alyssa replied, her enthusiasm pouring through the screen. "Oh my gosh, Nate, I can't believe you messaged me. Yes, I'm so excited about prom. It's the biggest event of the year." Martin chuckled to himself, imagining her wide-eyed excitement. He continued the conversation, pretending to be Nate, and gradually steered it toward the prom. "I've always wanted to go to a school prom," he wrote. "Maybe I should crash yours. What do you think?" Alyssa's response was immediate. "You should. I would love to be your date. Everyone would be so jealous." Martin leaned back, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. The plan was working. He suggested that Alyssa prepare for a grand entrance, hinting that he would meet her at the prom. She eagerly agreed, promising to make the night unforgettable. Over the next few days, Martin learned more about Alyssa's life through their conversations. Beneath her confident facade, there were cracks. She often complained about her adoptive parents, who she claimed didn't understand her. Martin discovered that Alyssa had been taken in by the Bennetts after her biological mother's death, and while they provided for her financially, their relationship was strained. Despite her wealth and popularity, Alyssa seemed desperate for validation, constantly seeking attention and approval. Martin felt a pang of empathy, but pushed it aside. This wasn't about pity, it was about accountability. As prom approached, Martin finalized his plan. He enlisted the help of a local theater actor, an older man with a flair for the dramatic. Martin paid him to pose as Nate Carter on prom night, knowing the reveal would be the centerpiece of Alyssa's lesson. Meanwhile, Alyssa spared no expense in preparing for the event. She sold one of her adoptive mother's cherished necklaces to rent a luxury car and buy an extravagant gown. She imagined the gasps of her classmates as she arrived with a celebrity, basking in the spotlight. Martin shared the plan with Elena, who listened with a mix of concern and amusement. "You're really going through with this, huh?" she said. "Yeah," Martin replied. "I know it might not change anything for her, but it'll be a moment she won't forget. And maybe, just maybe, it'll make her think twice about how she treats people." Elena sighed but nodded. "Just promise me one thing. Don't let this consume you. You've already come so far, Martin. Don't let her drag you back down." "I promise," he said, though he couldn't shake the anticipation building in his chest. The night of the prom loomed closer, and with each passing day, Martin felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. As he and Elena finalized their own preparations, he couldn't help but wonder how the night would unfold. Would Alyssa learn her lesson? Would the plan go off without a hitch? Martin didn't know for sure, but one thing was certain. Prom night would be unforgettable for everyone involved. Prom night had finally arrived, and the air buzzed with excitement. The school gymnasium had been transformed into a shimmering ballroom, with fairy lights strung across the ceiling and tables adorned with elaborate centerpieces. Students arrived in their best attire, the air filled with laughter, anticipation, and whispers of who would make the most dramatic entrance. Alyssa, draped in a dazzling crimson gown that hugged her figure perfectly, stepped out of the luxury car she had rented. The dress sparkled under the streetlights, and her heels clicked confidently against the pavement. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled in loose, cascading waves. She radiated confidence, and she knew it. Tonight was her night. She glanced at her phone, checking for messages. There it was, a text from Nate Carter. "I'm here. Meet me by the stage in 10 minutes. We'll make the grand entrance together." Alyssa's heart raced with excitement. The thought of walking into prom with a rising celebrity sent shivers down her spine. She could already hear the gasps and see the envious stares. Smiling to herself, she made her way toward the stage. Inside the gymnasium, Martin and Elena stood near the entrance, blending into the crowd. Elena wore a soft blue gown that accentuated her natural beauty, her hair styled elegantly. Martin, in a tailored suit that fit his newly transformed physique, stood tall with a quiet confidence. Together, they turned heads as they entered, a stark contrast to their former selves. "Ready?" Elena asked, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Martin nodded, his eyes scanning the room for Alyssa. "Let's see how this unfolds." As the clock struck 8 p.m., the prom host took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome tonight's special guest, a surprise date who's traveled far to be here." The crowd fell silent, their curiosity piqued. Alyssa stepped onto the stage, her smile dazzling as she waved to her classmates. Whispers filled the room. Everyone knew Alyssa loved being the center of attention, but this was on another level. Then, from the wings of the stage, a figure emerged. The crowd collectively gasped. Standing there was a disheveled older man, his suit wrinkled and his face unshaven. His hair was messy, and he carried himself with exaggerated theatrics, a wide, awkward grin plastered across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man said, bowing dramatically, "I am Nate Carter." His voice echoed across the room, loud and comical. Alyssa's face froze. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice trembling as she turned to the man. "This isn't Nate Carter." The man continued his performance, oblivious to her protests. "Thank you, Alyssa, for inviting me to this wonderful prom. It's an honor to be here." He extended his hand toward her with a flourish, waiting for her to play along. The room erupted into laughter. Some students doubled over, unable to contain themselves, while others whispered behind their hands. Alyssa's carefully curated image began to crumble under the weight of their mockery. "Is this a joke?" Alyssa demanded, her voice rising. Her cheeks flushed red and her hands trembled as she stepped back from the man. She looked out at the crowd, her classmates' laughter ringing in her ears. Among them, she caught sight of Martin and Elena, standing calmly near the back, their expressions unreadable. Meanwhile, Martin felt a mix of satisfaction and unease. Seeing Alyssa on stage, flustered and vulnerable, wasn't as gratifying as he'd imagined. He glanced at Elena, who watched the scene unfold with a pensive look. "Do you think this is enough?" Elena asked quietly, her voice carrying an undertone of concern. Martin hesitated. I don't know. Maybe." Alyssa, desperate to salvage the situation, turned to the crowd. "This isn't what it looks like. He's not the real Nate Carter. This is some kind of mistake." But her words were drowned out by the laughter that echoed around her. Her ex-boyfriend, standing near the punch table, smirked. "Guess you got what you deserved," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Alyssa's composure shattered. Tears welled up in her eyes as she fled the stage, pushing past the crowd and out of the gymnasium. She didn't stop running until she reached the parking lot, her breath hitching with sobs. She leaned against the rented car, her mind spinning. How had everything gone so wrong? Back in the gym, the crowd began to settle as the music resumed. Martin and Elena exchanged a glance. "I think she's had enough," Elena said softly, her hand resting lightly on Martin's arm. "Humiliating her like this won't erase what happened to you." Martin sighed, her words hitting him harder than he expected. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, the adrenaline from the moment beginning to fade. "Let's get out of here." As they turned to leave, Martin couldn't help but reflect on the night's events. He had wanted Alyssa to feel the pain she had caused him, but now he wondered if it had been worth it. Revenge might bring satisfaction, but it didn't heal the wounds left behind. Outside, Alyssa sat alone in the car, her tears staining her perfect makeup. She pulled out her phone, hoping for some kind of solace, but the texts from Nate Carter had stopped. It was then that a new text appeared from her adoptive mother.
"We need to talk. Come home immediately."
Alyssa's heart sank. The weight of her actions, from selling the necklace to her cruel treatment of others, began to press down on her. The reality of her choices was finally catching up with her. Inside the prom hall, Martin and Elena walked out into the cool night air. The sounds of laughter and music faded behind them as they made their way to the parking lot. "Do you regret it?" Elena asked as they reached Martin's car. He paused, looking up at the stars. "A little," he admitted. "But I think I've learned something tonight. I don't want to be defined by what happened to me, or by what I've done." Elena smiled, her hand brushing against his. "You're stronger than you think, Martin, and you've already come so far." As they drove away from the school, leaving the chaos of prom night behind, Martin felt a strange sense of closure. The night had been a turning point, not just for Alyssa, but for him as well. Though their paths had crossed in pain and anger, it was clear that the lessons learned would shape their futures in unexpected ways. The aftermath of prom night left ripples throughout the school and beyond. The laughter and whispers of the event lingered in the hallways like a storm that had just passed. But for Alyssa Bennett, the storm was only beginning. Alyssa returned home late, her makeup smeared and her gown crumpled. She stepped into the house, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, only to find her adoptive parents, Linda and Charles, waiting in the living room. The atmosphere was heavy, and the silence screamed louder than words. Linda held up an empty jewelry box, her expression a mix of disappointment and anger. "Where is it, Alyssa?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Alyssa froze, her heart racing. "Where's what?" "My necklace, the one I cherished, the one you stole and sold for that prom dress." Linda's voice cracked with restrained emotion. Alyssa's throat went dry. I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to what?" Charles interrupted, his tone sharper than Linda's. "Didn't mean to betray the trust we placed in you? Didn't mean to humiliate this family after all we've done for you?" The words hit Alyssa like a tidal wave. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but no excuse came. Her father's stern gaze bore into her, and she realized there was no escaping the truth. Linda sighed, setting the empty jewelry box down on the coffee table. "Alyssa, we've overlooked so much. Your behavior, your arrogance, your refusal to appreciate what you've been given. But this is too much." "What are you saying?" Alyssa whispered, her voice trembling. Charles folded his arms. "We're saying we're done. We can't continue to support you while you treat us, and everyone around you, with such disrespect, It's time you go back to your grandmother." "No," Alyssa gasped, tears pooling in her eyes. "You can't send me back there. I'll do better, I promise." "It's not just about doing better," Linda said, her voice heavy with sadness. "It's about learning the value of kindness and humility. Maybe some time away from this life will help you understand that." Alyssa's pleas fell on deaf ears. The decision had been made. The next morning, Alyssa found herself standing at the bus station with a single suitcase. The realization of how far she had fallen began to settle in as the events of prom night played on a loop in her mind. The laughter, the whispers, and her own humiliation felt like an endless echo. She boarded the bus, her hands gripping the handle of her suitcase tightly. As the city faded into the distance, she thought about her adoptive parents, who had once welcomed her into their home with open arms after her mother's passing. She remembered the opportunities they had given her, the warmth they had shown, and she realized how much she had taken it all for granted. The countryside came into view, and Alyssa felt a pang of dread. Her grandmother's small, weathered house stood in stark contrast to the luxury she had grown accustomed to. As the bus pulled into the station, she stepped off with a heavy heart, knowing she had no choice but to face this new reality. Life with her grandmother was vastly different. The days were quiet and slow, filled with chores and simplicity. Alyssa's phone, once her lifeline to social status, had no reception in the remote area. She found herself alone with her thoughts, replaying her choices and the harm she had caused. She thought about Martin, the boy she had humiliated at her party, and how he had transformed into someone confident and admired. She thought about Elena, who had stood up for Martin despite being treated poorly herself. And she thought about her adoptive parents who had given her so much, only to be met with ingratitude. For the first time in her life, Alyssa felt the weight of her actions. She began to see the cracks in the perfect image she had tried to maintain. Beneath the surface, she was a scared, insecure girl who had hurt others to mask her own pain. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alyssa sat at the small wooden desk in her grandmother's house. She pulled out a piece of paper and began to write. "Dear Martin, I don't know where to start, but I owe you an apology. What I did to you was cruel and unforgivable, and I can't imagine how much it hurt you. I was selfish and thoughtless, and I used you to make myself feel powerful. I see now how wrong I was. You didn't deserve what I did to you, and I'm sorry for every bit of pain I caused. I hope one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I'm trying to change, and I want to be a better person, not just for others, but for myself. Thank you for showing me what strength really looks like. Alyssa." She folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. The act of writing it felt like a small step toward redemption. Alyssa's days in the countryside were humbling. Her grandmother's wisdom and quiet strength became a source of guidance. Through hard work and reflection, Alyssa began to understand the value of humility and the importance of treating others with respect. For the first time, she saw the world not as a stage for her own drama, but as a place where everyone was struggling in their own way. She resolved to be kinder, more compassionate, and more mindful of her actions. As Alyssa looked out at the field surrounding her grandmother's house, she felt a strange sense of peace. Though her life had been turned upside down, she knew she had been given a second chance, a chance to grow, to change, and to become someone she could be proud of. And this time, she wouldn't waste it. The weeks following the prom and Alyssa's departure brought a wave of change, not just for her, but for everyone involved. The quiet hum of transformation rippled through lives, sowing seeds of forgiveness, growth, and hope. For Martin Reeves, life felt like a new beginning. His physical transformation was only the surface of a much deeper change. The confidence he gained from overcoming his struggles and the bond he had built with Elena Gray gave him a renewed purpose. No longer the boy who hid in the shadows of his insecurities, Martin now walked through the school halls with his head held high. Students who once mocked him now greeted him with respect, but Martin knew that their approval didn't define him. What mattered most was how he saw himself, and he finally liked what he saw. Martin poured his energy into his studies and extracurricular activities, joining the school's debate team and even taking up a leadership role in the student council. He realized that his strength lay not just in his transformation, but in his resilience. One afternoon, Martin found a letter waiting for him in his locker. The handwriting was delicate, unfamiliar. As he opened it, his heart raced. "Dear Martin, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I had to try. What I did to you was wrong on so many levels, and I can never undo the pain I caused. I've realized how much damage my actions have done, not just to you, but to myself. I want to change. I'm sorry, truly. Alyssa." Martin read the letter twice, then a third time. The words felt genuine, but forgiveness wasn't something he could offer lightly. After all, the scars of humiliation still lingered. Yet, he realized that holding on to anger would only keep him tethered to the past. Meanwhile, Elena found herself thriving in ways she never expected. The friendship she had formed with Martin blossomed into something more. Their bond, forged in the fires of shared pain, became a source of mutual encouragement and joy. With Martin's encouragement, Elena applied for an art scholarship she had once been too shy to consider. Her sketches, full of raw emotion and vivid imagination, earned her recognition she never thought possible. For the first time, Elena believed she had a future worth fighting for. One evening, while they worked on a class project together, Elena asked Martin, "Do you ever think about what happened with Alyssa?" Martin hesitated, then nodded. "I do. A part of me still feels angry, but I think I'm ready to move on. She wrote me a letter. I think she's trying to change." Elena smiled softly. Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's a gift we give ourselves too. In the countryside, Alyssa continued to reflect on her life. Living with her grandmother grounded her in a way she hadn't experienced before. The simplicity of rural life, mornings spent tending the garden, afternoons reading by the window, gave her time to think about who she wanted to be. She began volunteering at a local community center, teaching younger children basic reading and math skills. The experience humbled her further, showing her the joy of giving rather than taking. For the first time, she saw herself as part of something bigger than her own desires. One day, as she helped a young girl solve a math problem, Alyssa felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. "Thank you, Miss Alyssa," the girl said, beaming. Alyssa smiled. "You're welcome. You're doing great." In that moment, Alyssa realized that her value didn't lie in popularity or material things. It lay in kindness, humility, and the connections she built with others. Months later, back in the city, Alyssa decided it was time to face her past. She contacted Martin and asked if they could meet. To her surprise, he agreed. They met at a quiet cafe near the school, the air thick with unspoken words. Alyssa arrived first, clutching her cup of tea nervously. When Martin walked in, she felt a pang of guilt seeing how confident and composed he looked. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi," Martin replied, sitting across from her. There was a long silence before Alyssa spoke. "Thank you for meeting me. I know I don't deserve it." Martin nodded, his expression neutral. "I got your letter." "I meant every word," Alyssa said, her voice trembling. "I was cruel, selfish, and lost, but I'm trying to change. I wanted you to know that." Martin studied her for a moment. "I appreciate that. What you did hurt me in ways I didn't even understand at the time. But I've realized something. Holding on to that anger doesn't help me. Forgiving you doesn't mean forgetting, but it does mean I can move forward." Tears welled in Alyssa's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. As they parted ways, both felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Alyssa returned to her grandmother's house with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to continue building a life she could be proud of. Martin returned to school, ready to face the future with strength and clarity. In the weeks that followed, Martin and Elena continued to support each other, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Together, they reflected on the journey they had taken, from pain to healing, from rejection to belonging. One evening, as they watched the sunset from a park bench, Martin turned to Elena and said, "You know, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're stronger than we think, And kindness, it has the power to change everything. Elena smiled, taking his hand in hers. It really does. The story ended not with revenge or bitterness, but with growth, forgiveness, and the belief that everyone has the capacity to change. It was a reminder that life is not defined by the challenges we face, but by how we rise above them. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your own stories of resilience and kindness in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Together, let's spread a little more hope in the world.